Hey guys, tonight we drift down toward the edge of the Atlantic, where the water laps gently at the dark sand of a West African shoreline. You can almost hear the soft clatter of wooden paddles slipping into the water, the creak of rope against canoe hulls, and the murmur of men shifting sacks heavy with salt or cola nuts. A faint moon hangs overhead, silvering the waves, and you realize that hundreds of years ago, this exact hush carried the sound of traders preparing to leave. Not warriors with spears, not explorers looking for new continents, just ordinary people, merchants and fishermen, who tied their livelihoods to the restless rhythm of tides. You're probably not going to survive a midnight paddle across the Atlantic in one of those canoes, though. Honestly, you'd be lucky to survive 5 minutes without a life jacket. But the traders here weren't planning to cross the whole ocean. At least, not yet. Their world was coastal, rhythmic, and deeply familiar, stretching between creeks, sandbars, and estuaries that offered both opportunity and danger. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments, so I know where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The shoreline you stand on isn't empty, though the moonlight makes it look that way. Behind you, there are mud-walled houses with thatched roofs, palm trees leaning like gossiping neighbors, and the faint glow of cooking fires now reduced to glowing embers. This is a place tied into centuries of exchange long before Europeans bothered to show up. Traders here already knew the sea as a neighbor, not a stranger. They could tell you when to set sail just by watching the color of the waves or the angle of seabirds. Salt was a treasure, scraped from crusty flats or hacked from ancient mines inland, carried down here in slow caravans. To you, salt is just what makes fries edible. But in this time, it was the difference between life and spoilage, between preserved food and rot. Bundles of salt stacked on the sand looked unassuming, but they might as well have been bars of silver. And then there was gold. Fine dust carried in gourds, sometimes packed into bamboo, so bright under the moonlight that you'd almost mistake it for fairy dust if you weren't careful. The kingdoms inland, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, already pulsed with gold trade across the Sahara, long before the Atlantic roots grew teeth. What trickled down to the coast shimmered like a promise, the sort of wealth that could make strangers row out of the darkness. But tonight, it's cola nuts you notice most. Small, reddish-brown, bitter on the tongue but loaded with caffeine, these little seeds traveled like gossip. They were chewed to keep awake during long negotiations, offered as gifts in markets, and exchanged like pocket-sized treasure. Historians still argue whether cola nuts or gold held more sway in shaping regional alliances. The truth is, you don't sip a warm evening drink in 15th century West Africa without cola buzzing somewhere in your bloodstream. The boats on the beach are narrow, carved from single logs, smeared with resin that smells sharp in the cool air. Traders have stacked them with baskets wrapped in palm leaves. They'll paddle down the coast, sometimes hugging lagoons and estuaries, sometimes venturing across risky open stretches. Quiet journeys, really. Nothing like the thunderous Age of Discovery paintings you may have seen in school. These trips were as routine as your morning commute, though far saltier and with a significantly higher chance of running into a crocodile. Speaking of crocodiles, one quirky local practice still whispered about is the use of crocodile dung in certain healing or protective rituals. Imagine paddling at night, glancing nervously at the riverbanks, and knowing that the same animal people feared was also mixed into charms. Practical? Maybe not. But when you live with danger, sometimes you fold it into your belief system. The coastal air here is heavy, humid enough to bead sweat on your forehead, even as the moon cools the waves. You hear laughter, the kind that bursts out between tired men adjusting their loads. Trade wasn't all solemn exchanges. It was as much about community, jokes, and the shared annoyance of hauling one more basket of peppercorns than your back really wanted. At a distance, the coastline flickers with other fires, other camps. This wasn't a uniform space, but a patchwork of polities. Small chiefdoms, larger kingdoms, fishing villages with their own rules. Some were open to foreign trade, others guarded their beaches with suspicion. One mainstream historical fact is that long before European ships arrived, these communities were already linked by sea routes stretching hundreds of miles, from Senegambia to the Bight of Benin. The Atlantic world didn't start with outsiders. It started with Africans themselves, stringing together shores like beads on a necklace, and you stand here, moonlight on your shoulders, imagining the rhythm of paddles dipping. You almost want to step into the canoe to feel the slow rock of wood under your feet, but you know your balance isn't great. You'd probably end up in the water within seconds, and honestly, no one's rescuing you at 2 a.m. in 1500. The traders launch quietly. They don't shout, don't trumpet their departure. A push, a splash, the scrape of wood against sand, and they're gliding away. You hear the faint slap of waves against the bow, the murmured prayers, the groan of shoulders settling into the long night of paddling. The horizon swallows them one by one, until only the ripple trails remain. The silence that follows is both eerie and comforting. You realize that history often happened this way, not in fanfare, not in battles, but in quiet departures under a sleepy moon. The big events are just highlights. The real fabric of the Atlantic world was woven on nights like this, when a few canoes shoved off into darkness, carrying nothing more spectacular than salted fish, cola nuts, and the quiet hope of a fair trade tomorrow. You follow the dusty path away from the sea, the air shifting from salty humidity to the dry tang of inland winds. Your sandals kick up a thin film of grit, and the land stretches before you in pale yellows and muted browns, punctuated by wiry grasses and stubborn thorn trees. Somewhere in the distance, a low bell jingles, followed by another, and then the grumbling snort of camels. The caravan is coming into view. Imagine it, long strings of humped beasts swaying awkwardly, each one carrying sacks strapped to wooden saddles. Men in loose robes walk alongside, their sandals flapping, their heads wrapped in cloth against the sun. The camels look bored, like they've heard every desert story twice already, but their heavy steps are the reason salt, gold, and all manner of goods can move from the heart of Africa to the sea. You join the caravan, and suddenly you feel its rhythm. The creak of leather harnesses, the dull clink of cooking pots hanging from saddle frames, the low hum of traders murmuring to pass the time. A young boy at the back of the line flicks at flies with a twig, muttering that he'd rather be swimming. Honestly, same. Mainstream history tells you that these routes were the lifeblood of great empires, Mali, Songhai, feeding cities like Timbuktu and Gao with wealth from gold and knowledge from books. But as you walk beside the caravan, you realize it wasn't all glorious wealth. Most of the time, it was slow, sweaty drudgery, dust in your throat, cracked heels, endless horizon. If your phone battery dies on a long walk today, you panic. Imagine doing this with no podcasts except the sound of a camel chewing loudly next to you. Historians still argue whether these trans-Saharan caravans were primarily state-controlled operations or looser networks run by private merchants. You look at the faces around you, men of different accents, skin shades, and temperaments, and it feels more like a messy mix than any neat category. Some might represent kingdoms, others are just hustlers making ends meet. One thing is certain. Everyone here knows the value of moving goods from point A to point B, no matter how dry and dangerous the journey. You notice the salt sacks in particular. They're heavy, wrapped in leather, and treated like treasure. To inland communities, salt is life. To coastal ones, it's just something the ocean spits up. But that difference turns into profit. It's like being the one person in a friend group who knows how to fix Wi-Fi. Suddenly you're indispensable. And gold. Tiny pouches tied discreetly, glinting when the sun hits them through loose fabric. The carriers keep them close, whispering protective prayers. Gold dust might end up thousands of miles away, minted into coins in far-off Europe, but tonight it jingles softly with each camel's step. There's a quirky detail about these caravans you might enjoy. Sometimes they carried not just goods, but entire portable markets. A man might lead a donkey laden with dyed cloth, and when they paused at an oasis, he'd unfurl it right there to sell. Imagine if a modern highway rest stop also included a full pop-up mall, though without the suspicious gas station hot dogs. The caravan halts at a watering hole. Camels groan in relief, collapsing onto their folded legs like tired commuters finally getting a seat on the train. The men gather around a fire, brewing tea in small metal pots. The bitter liquid smells sharp, almost medicinal, but it cuts through the dust in your mouth. Someone offers you a cola nut, and though its taste is harsh and earthy, it jolts you awake in a way coffee never quite does. You chew slowly, your jaw working, and realize this tiny nut is the invisible engine behind countless late-night negotiations. As the fire crackles, stories float through the circle. A man swears he saw a desert spirit appear in the shimmer of heat waves. Another laughs, saying it was probably just his cousin sneaking a nap behind a dune. Somewhere, a boy produces a small drum and taps a lazy rhythm. Trade might be serious business, but downtime is still downtime. You lie back against your pack and look up at the sky. The stars here feel absurdly close, as though someone sprinkled diamonds right above your head. No light pollution, no buzzing neon signs, just pure night. You remember the coastal moonlit canoes, and you realize it's all connected. From the ocean shore to this caravan rest, people moved goods, ideas, and cultures quietly, steadily, long before anyone drew neat triangles in a textbook. One camel shifts in its sleep, groaning like an old man with sore knees. You chuckle softly, knowing you're not the only one who complains about long journeys. And somewhere in the quiet, you sense the weight of history. Thousands of feet pressing these same trails, leaving grooves in the earth that no desert wind can quite erase. The night fades, and you're still walking with the caravan, but now a salty breeze rolls in again. The landscape softens into marshy flats and estuaries, and the horizon glitters with something unfamiliar. Wooden ships with pale canvas wings, hovering like awkward seabirds just offshore. You squint. These aren't the carved canoes you saw earlier. These are boxier, bulkier, and clearly not built here. You're watching the first hesitant Portuguese arrivals. The year might be the mid-1400s, give or take, and their ships wobble, as if even the waves are unimpressed. On deck, sailors in wool tunics shade their eyes, pointing toward the coast where smoke rises from villages. They're trying to look brave, but you can almost hear their stomachs churning. They're far from Lisbon, far from anything familiar, and their ships creak like they're questioning this entire adventure. The locals aren't rushing to greet them either. Traders on shore lean on their spears and paddles, weighing options. Are these newcomers friends, foes, or just another batch of confused foreigners who'll vanish once their provisions run out? You stand in the middle, sensing the tension ripple between two worlds that don't yet know how entangled they're about to become. A mainstream historical fact here. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions that edged further down the West African coast during this period. The Portuguese were hungry for gold, pepper, and direct access to trade routes that had long flowed through North Africa and the Mediterranean. But as much as textbooks frame them as bold discoverers, the reality is funnier. They were basically lost guys trying not to get sunburned while figuring out if anyone wanted to swap fish for European textiles. One quirky tidbit: the Portuguese sometimes mistook manatees for mermaids. Imagine trudging across seas for months, spotting a round, whiskery creature, and convincing yourself it's a beautiful siren. After that much salted pork and stale biscuits, maybe your brain just starts lowering its standards. The sailors lower a boat into the shallows. Oars splash. A handful of men row toward shore, their beards bristling, their hands nervously fingering rosaries. On the beach, traders adjust their cloaks, exchange a few glances, and step forward. No shouting, no dramatic clash, just cautious curiosity. Someone offers a piece of cloth, brightly dyed, in exchange for a handful of metal trinkets. A small laugh breaks out when the strangers nearly trip trying to step onto dry sand. Historians still argue whether these early encounters were peaceful exchanges, tense standoffs, or a messy blend of both. The sources often contradict themselves. European records highlight brave landings, while oral traditions sometimes paint the newcomers as laughably awkward. You suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. Cautious business with a side of mutual suspicion. You wander closer, feeling the humid air press against your skin. The Portuguese bring beads, copper, and iron tools, hoping to impress. The Africans display ivory, pepper, and yes, a little gold dust that catches the light. It's not a grand negotiation yet, more like a neighbor testing whether you'll return the borrowed lawnmower. Behind you, children peek from palm huts, giggling at the odd clothes. Dogs bark at the smell of salted fish spilling from foreign barrels. And in the middle of it all, you see the traders' sharp eyes calculating. If these strangers can be turned into another node in the vast web of exchange, then so be it. By evening, the Portuguese row back, their boat heavier with peppercorns and lighter of trinkets. They mutter about profit margins, probably unaware that their new partners are judging them just as keenly. No cannon fire, no heroic conquest. Just a quiet bargain that will, slowly and steadily, spiral into centuries of entanglement. The shoreline settles into silence again. Crickets chirp, palm fronds rustle, You think back to the caravans trudging inland and the canoes slipping out under moonlight, and you realize these awkward ships are just the newest actors on a stage already crowded with centuries of trade. And honestly, the Portuguese looked less like bold adventurers tonight, and more like tourists fumbling with the wrong adapter plug. The shoreline quiets after the Portuguese have rowed away, and you drift back toward the market spaces, where the air is thick with spice, sweat, and bargaining. Here, it isn't the creak of European ships that matters. It's the thump of baskets being lowered, the rustle of palm mats, and the clamour of voices rising like a song. You step into the crowd, and immediately your senses are hijacked. The first smell to grab you is salt. Not just the ocean, but slabs of crystalline salt dragged from mines in the Sahara and stacked like bricks. Men tap them with iron rods, listening for the hollow tone that says, good quality. For inlanders, this salt will be life, preserving meat and fish, even flavouring porridge. For coastal dwellers, it's ordinary, but with distance, ordinary becomes precious. Beside it, gold glints faintly in the sunlight. Not big nuggets, but powder sifted into gourds, sometimes pressed into little cakes. Traders tilt their containers to let buyers glimpse the shimmer. The amount you see could one day be melted into coins in Venice, or plated onto crosses in a church you'll never visit. Yet here, it's just another item in the noise of trade. Then you catch the earthy, almost medicinal scent of cola nuts. Piled high in woven baskets, their smooth shells gleam red and brown. A trader cracks one open with his teeth, chewing with practiced ease. He offers you one. You hesitate, bite, down, and immediately regret it. It's bitter, chalky, and a little like gnawing on aspirin. But within moments, your tongue tingles, and your eyelids snap awake. This tiny seed, caffeine-rich and ancient, is the original pick-me-up long before anyone dreamed of lattes or energy drinks. Historians still argue whether cola nuts or gold were more influential in shaping regional alliances. Gold brought outsiders to the coast, yes, but cola bound people together in daily rituals, social obligations, and endless nights of negotiation. Sometimes what seems small is the true giant. You wander deeper into the market, brushing past cloth, stalls where indigo-dyed fabric flaps lazily in the breeze. Women call out prices, snapping their fingers sharply to draw attention. A boy dashes by with a tray of smoked fish, its aroma salty sweet, making your stomach rumble. You wonder how many stomachs across the Atlantic world were filled with flavours born here. One quirky detail pops into your head. In some areas, cola nuts weren't just chewed, but used ceremonially, offered as signs of respect, peace, or even marriage negotiations. Forget rings. Imagine pulling out a basket of bitter nuts and saying, "Here, my love, chew this for eternity." Romantic, in a slightly jaw-aching way. The market buzzes louder as an argument breaks out between two men over the weight of a gold pouch. Their voices rise, gestures fly, but then, almost magically, a mediator steps in. He's calm, authoritative, reminding them both of community ties. No fight, no collapse, just a reminder that trade is as much about trust as it is about goods. And you notice something else. Despite the absence of coins or standardized currency, everyone knows the values here. Cloth equals a basket of cola, salt slab equals so many strings of cowries. Pepper, ivory, leather, all measured against each other in a delicate balance. It's a system invisible to outsiders, but utterly clear to those who live it. You watch a man carefully count cowries, tiny shells strung together in neat loops. He pauses, shakes his head, and adds two more to seal the bargain. The shells rattle softly, like a miniature ocean echoing in his hands. To you, they look like trinkets, but here they carry weight as real as paper money in your wallet. The sun climbs high, pressing sweat from every pore. Traders retreat to shade, sipping water from calabash bowls, nibbling roasted grains. Children weave between stalls, laughing as they chase each other through the dust. A drummer starts a rhythm, soft at first, then rolling into a steady beat. Markets weren't only about goods, they were theatres of sound, smell, and performance. You lean against a post, chewing another cola nut despite your tongue's protests, and reflect. The salt slabs, the glittering dust, the buzzing nuts, they're all quiet engines of an Atlantic world being built without fanfare. It's not the drama of conquest or the thunder of guns. It's trade as old as humanity, shaping destinies basket by basket. By the time the sun dips, the market is thinning. Goods are packed away, debts noted, gossip exchanged. The smell of fish smoke fades into the heavier scent of evening fires. You step back, watching the traders head home, their shadows long and bent. Tomorrow it will happen again, another quiet dance of salt, gold, and cola nuts. And honestly, you'd almost trade your modern snack aisle just to spend another day chewing bitter cola and bartering for indigo cloth. Almost. The market clears, and you find yourself drifting into a smaller square where the noise softens. Here, trade isn't piled high in baskets or shouted over drums. Instead, it's quieter, more deliberate. Objects set down, picked up, weighed in the palm and exchanged with a nod. This is a market without coins, and it hums with its own strange elegance. You step closer to a stall where a woman spreads out strips of cloth, indigo dyed and patterned with resist designs that look like constellations. She isn't naming a price. Instead, she glances at your basket of cola nuts and gestures. 2 strips for the basket. You hesitate, not because you don't understand, but because it feels too simple. Where's the clinking coin? The balance scale? Here, value is a conversation, not a number stamped on metal. Nearby, another trader empties a pouch of cowries. The shells spill onto a mat like a tiny avalanche. Each is smooth, white, and curved like a grin. You pick one up, rolling it between your fingers, and it feels absurd. This little shell might buy you dinner. Yet in West Africa, cowries arrived in sacks from the Indian Ocean, funneled through North African trade, and became a standard of exchange. Their value wasn't natural. It was trust, habit, and shared agreement. A shell's worth more than a shiny rock if everyone says it is. Historians still argue whether cowries undermined or empowered local economies. Some claim their influx destabilized value systems. Others suggest they slotted neatly into traditions of barter, enabling larger-scale trade. The truth, as always, is muddier. You watch a man stringing shells carefully like rosary beads, and you realize, regardless of scholarly debate, for him they're dinner, security, maybe even status. A quirky tidbit drifts your way. Some communities used cloth as currency, folding bolts of woven cotton or silk into their calculations. In certain places, these bolts were stored like treasure, passed down like heirlooms. Imagine leaving your kids not a savings account, but a carefully folded stack of patterned fabric. Honestly, it might be more stylish. You trail after a young trader who's carrying smoked fish. He stops before a basket of salt slabs, eyes it, and begins bargaining. The 2 traders don't raise their voices. Instead, they gesture with their hands, tap the fish, tap the salt, shake their heads, tap again. Finally, one man slides over an extra fillet, and the deal is sealed. Not a coin exchanged, just fish for salt. In the corner, an elder acts as a living calculator. People approach him with disputes. How many cowries equal 2 bolts of cloth? How much pepper for a half-gourd of gold dust? His memory is the archive, his authority the ledger. You marvel at this. No banks, no printed notes, just community trust and an elder's word. The air grows warm with midday sun, and shadows huddle under awnings. A boy drops his string of cowries, and they scatter across the dirt. Children scramble after them, shrieking with laughter, as if chasing coins at a birthday party. You smile, because even centuries later, kids and money are still the same chaos. The barter continues. Ivory tusks traded for copper pots, leather hides for beads, millet for cloth. Each item whispers a story of movement. That bead came from Venice, that copper from Europe, that cloth from local looms. You realize markets here weren't isolated. They were crossroads, absorbing and reshaping the world. A group of women sit in the shade, weaving. Their fingers move quickly, shuttling threads, and the cloth grows inch by inch. They're not just artisans, but money makers, literally spinning wealth into existence. The rhythm of their work hums against the drone of flies, the murmur of trade, the distant call of gulls. By afternoon, the deals wind down. People tie bundles, sling baskets, count cowries one last time. You notice how quiet it feels compared to the rattle of coins in your pocket. There's no metallic clink here, only the soft rustle of cloth, the faint rattle of shells, the weight of salt blocks. Value is tactile, audible, alive. As the market empties, you sit cross-legged in the dust, turning a cowrie shell over in your palm. Its smooth curve glimmers faintly, catching the last light. You think about how something so small could hold such weight in a world's economy. Then you remember how much you once paid for a cup of fancy coffee. And suddenly, it doesn't feel so strange. The wind shifts, carrying the smell of the sea again. Tomorrow the market will hum anew, and once more cloth, shells and goods will dance in their quiet calculus. Tonight, though, you pocket the cowrie as a keepsake, a reminder that value isn't about coins. It's about trust, rhythm, and the odd beauty of shells rattling softly in a woven bag. The market dust still clings to your sandals when you wander toward the harbour, where the real whispers of history often hid. You hear gulls squawking, ropes creaking, and water slapping against wood. Canoes are pulled high on the sand, some patched with tar that smells sharp and smoky. Farther out, you see larger vessels bobbing, some local, others with foreign rigging. But the loudest noise isn't the boats. It's the murmuring voices, low and deliberate, deals struck in the shadow of salt spray and canvas sails. Dockside life is less about ceremony and more about timing. You watch two traders lean against a pile of baskets, pretending to talk about the weather while their fingers slip small packets from one hand to another. You know that packet isn't seaweed, probably gold dust, maybe a rare spice. Here, bargains whisper louder than shouts. A mainstream historical fact. By the 1500s, ports like Elmina and others along the Gulf of Guinea had become hubs of exchange, not just for goods like ivory, pepper, and gold, but also for information. Sailors, translators, middlemen, all passed gossip faster than official envoys. The docks were, in a way, the internet of the early Atlantic, only with more rats and fewer cat videos. You edge closer to a group huddled near a barrel. They speak quickly, mixing languages, snatches of Portuguese, Wolof, Arabic. Their hands move like punctuation, tapping the barrel, adjusting a pouch, drawing a line in the sand with a stick. They argue briefly over the number of cowries, then suddenly laugh, slap each other's shoulders, and seal the bargain with a shared sip of palm wine. It's not elegant, but it works. Historians still argue whether these quiet dockside deals undermined official trade monopolies or supported them. Some suggest they eroded state control, bleeding wealth into private hands. Others argue they were the grease that kept the bigger machinery turning. You sip from an imaginary gourd and shrug. Either way, these murmurs mattered as much as the loud proclamations carved into treaties. And the quirky detail you notice, traders sometimes weighed gold dust by using little brass figurines shaped like animals or geometric designs. Imagine pulling out a tiny brass crocodile, setting it on one side of a scale, and balancing it with glittering dust. Suddenly, your weighing process looks more like playtime with toys. You can't help but grin at the thought of someone saying, "Hang on, let me grab my miniature brass monkey to double-check this deal." The harbour air is heavy with mixed scents. Fish drying on racks, tar heating in the sun, cloves spilling from a broken sack. Children dart between piles of goods, trying to sneak bites of cola or peppercorns, then coughing furiously when the spice hits their throats. Their laughter mixes with the shouts of dockhands unloading cargo. You pause near a canoe freshly dragged ashore. Its belly is slick with seawater, and inside lies a jumble of trade. Salt wrapped in cloth, smoked fish, palm oil sealed in gourds. The trader squats, running his hands over each item, counting silently. He glances around, then pulls a small pouch from beneath his cloak and presses it discreetly into another man's palm. The exchange is silent, but the tension in his eyes says volumes. There's no ledger here, no paper trail. But somehow everyone knows who owes what. Reputation is the currency. Betray someone, and your name sours faster than fish left in the sun. On these docks, your word is more binding than any contract stamped with wax. A sailor with sunburned cheeks approaches, holding out a roll of European cloth. He's desperate to swap it for pepper. His captain promised a profit back in Lisbon. But the local trader shakes his head. The cloth is poorly dyed, the weave too loose. He dismisses it with a laugh, and the sailor trudges away, muttering. Quality control existed long before Amazon reviews, and here, you couldn't fake it. The sun dips low, painting the harbour gold. Lanterns flicker on the ships, casting long ripples over the water. Deals slow but don't stop. Now conversations are softer, shadows deeper, and exchanges more secretive. Somewhere, a drum taps steadily, reminding you that music was as constant a presence as trade itself. You lean against a piling, watching a group of men load crates of pepper onto a boat bound for an offshore island. Each crate thumps hollowly as it lands, the smell sharp enough to sting your nose. It strikes you how unglamorous this work is. Backs aching, hands blistered, goods slipping through sweat-slicked fingers. And yet, these quiet movements shaped centuries of history. The night thickens, dockside murmurs blur into the steady rhythm of waves. You close your eyes, hearing the creak of rope, the slap of water, the muffled laughter of men sealing another bargain with a shared gourd. No trumpets, no proclamations, just whispers in the dark, and the soft assurance that tomorrow's deals will look much the same. And honestly, if history books focused more on these sleepy docks instead of just cannons and kings, maybe half your high school class wouldn't have dozed off. Well, except for the part where cola nuts taste like bitter shoe polish. That would have put them back to sleep. The dawn creeps back over the harbour, pale light stretching across the water like a thin sheet of silk. You're still there, though the dreamlike pace of things makes you wonder if a night or a century has passed. Boats groan softly against their ropes, and the first shouts of traders echo across the sand. The dock never really slept, it only paused to catch its breath. Now you notice something different. The quiet movement of traders beyond the water's edge. These aren't dockhands or sailors, they're travellers, black merchants from inland, their clothes dusty from long marches, their loads balanced high on heads or strapped onto donkeys. They step carefully into the rhythm of the coast as though slipping into a song already in progress. Here is where you meet the black traders on the move. Figures history often leaves in the margins. They weren't kings. They weren't enslaved. They weren't famous explorers. They were the in-between people who made sure the lines connecting salt mines, goldfields, forests, and ports never snapped. Without them, the great machines of empire would have sputtered like an old canoe taking on water. Picture them trudging across savannas under a sun that feels like it wants to peel your skin off. Dust rises with every step, stinging your nose, making your throat taste of chalk. At night, they gather by small fires, roasting scraps of dried fish, chewing bitter cola to stay awake. Their conversation drifts between prices, safe routes, and rumours. Which river ford is swollen? Which market cheated strangers? Which kingdom suddenly raised its tolls? A mainstream historical fact. Many of these traders belong to specialised communities. The Diula merchants, for example, became famous for carrying goods across vast regions of West Africa, blending commerce with Islam, and establishing networks that stretched from the Niger Basin to coastal towns. Others, like Hausa traders, moved textiles and leatherwork far beyond their homelands. They weren't just peddlers, they were logisticians, diplomats, cultural bridges. You imagine joining their caravan. The road isn't really a road. It's a faint track, sometimes swallowed by tall grass, sometimes veering around termite mounds taller than a man. Your feet ache, but the steady beat of donkey hooves sets a hypnotic rhythm. Someone hums a tune, low and repetitive, carrying you forward. By the time you reach a town, the marketplace bursts open like a drum beat. Goods spill across mats, brass bracelets, woven cloth, carved ivory, baskets of cola nuts. You stand amazed at the noise, but the traders move calmly, scanning everything with sharp eyes. They already know what's worth carrying farther and what's not. To you, it looks chaotic. To them, it's a perfectly tuned instrument. And here's the quirky detail you spot. Some traders carried talking drums as seriously as they carried food. With a few tight beats, they could send messages miles across the savannah, warning of bandits, announcing safe routes, or calling for backup if a deal turned sour. Imagine your GPS app replaced by a guy drumming, "Left at the big tree, don't trust the tall man with the goat." Surprisingly effective. You notice how the coastal and inland traders differ in dress. The inland men wear layered cotton robes, often dyed deep indigo, their heads wrapped in turbans against dust and sun. The coastal traders sport lighter cloth, brighter patterns, some even wearing trinkets of brass or shells around their necks. Their languages are different too, but somehow prices get agreed on. Human desire for profit is its own universal tongue. There's tension, of course. Inland merchants sometimes accuse coastal middlemen of underpaying for gold. Coastal traders grumble that caravan men overcharge for salt. Everyone complains about tolls demanded by local rulers who built forts or checkpoints along the roads. Yet here they are, shoulder to shoulder, still doing business. At one stall, a young Dula trader unrolls a strip of finely woven cloth. He strokes it lovingly, pointing out the tight weave, the even dye. The coastal buyer nods, but you see his eyes dart toward the trader's pouch where something heavy clinks softly. Gold dust, perhaps. A deal will be struck soon, half in plain sight, half in whispers. Night falls again, and the inland traders prepare to leave. You hear the bells jingling softly on donkeys' necks as they shuffle toward the inland paths. Lanterns glow like fireflies, bouncing in the dark. Their silhouettes stretch long across the savannah before fading into nothing. Tomorrow, they'll be 100 miles inland, repeating the process at another market, weaving invisible threads that bind the coast to the desert to the forest. You sit back, chewing on a cola nut offered by one of the traders before he left. The taste is bitter, sharp, almost electric, buzzing in your gums. Suddenly you understand why they chewed it. Fatigue melts away, replaced by a jittery focus. It's like the ancient version of an espresso shot, except it tastes like gnawing on tree bark. You almost laugh, thinking, who decided this was a good idea? Then again, caffeine is caffeine, and the road doesn't walk itself. As sleepiness returns, you reflect on how these nameless traders rarely appear in grand histories. No statues, no dates memorized in classrooms, no blockbuster movies. Yet without their steady footsteps and endless bargaining, the shimmering flow of gold, salt, cloth, and stories across West Africa would have dried up. They were the arteries of a continent, keeping the lifeblood moving while kings and empires claimed the credit. The fire dies down. You lean back, hearing once more the faint rhythm of donkey hooves fading into silence. You wonder if those footsteps still echo in modern markets, in diaspora kitchens, in the quiet persistence of people carrying more than anyone ever notices. And as your eyelids sink, you think, maybe the dullest histories are the ones that only talk about crowns and cannons, forgetting the dusty sandals that really held everything together. The night hums softly again, this time with the low lapping of waves against hulls. You drift closer to the water's edge, where ships bob like tethered shadows. Their masts rise into the sky like skeletal fingers, and the creak of ropes feels almost like breathing. These are no longer the awkward first arrivals you saw earlier. The vessels now stretch taller, heavier, and strangely confident, as if the Portuguese have decided they're here to stay. Step onto one of the docks, and you find yourself face to face with the early forts, stone outposts clinging stubbornly to the shoreline. The most famous, Elmina, would rise in 1482, a fortress of pale stone with towers glaring inland like suspicious neighbours. Inside its walls, Portuguese officials strut about in puffed sleeves, trying hard to look important while secretly sweating in the humidity. The structure doesn't look like it belongs here at all, like someone dragged a chunk of Europe onto the sand and told it to behave. A mainstream historical fact, these forts were built to control trade, not people, at least at first. The Portuguese dreamed of monopolizing gold, pepper, and ivory, keeping rival Europeans away and impressing local rulers with their architectural bravado. But the plan was never simple. Coastal kings and chiefs weren't passive spectators. They negotiated every brick, every alliance, every exchange of goods. Sometimes, permission to build came only after elaborate ceremonies, gifts, or marriage alliances. You wander through the fort's courtyard. A blacksmith hammers metal tools, sparks flying. Clerks scratch numbers into ledgers, muttering about profit margins. In the chapel, candles flicker in the thick air, their wax melting faster than anyone can pray. The smell is a mix of salt, fish, and the unmistakable dampness of stone that doesn't quite dry. What surprises you most is how alive the place feels. Not like a military bunker, but like a crowded marketplace squashed inside a castle. Traders from inland stroll through the gates, their packs rattling with cola nuts and textiles. They glance at the walls with curiosity but little awe, as if to say, "Nice try, foreigners, but we've been doing this long before you showed up." Here's a quirky tidbit. The Portuguese, desperate to survive the new climate, sometimes smeared themselves with local herbal concoctions, hoping to ward off fevers. Some even wore amulets sold by African healers, little pouches filled with powders or charms, while still clutching their rosaries. Imagine a man swaggering about in armour, a crucifix dangling from one hand, and a tiny leather pouch tied to his belt. just in case. Practicality beats pride when mosquitoes are winning, and then comes the sound of bargaining. The Portuguese spread bolts of wool cloth, copper basins, and beads. The African traders counter with elephant tusks stacked like pale pillars, baskets brimming with pepper, or glints of gold dust carried in gourds. You watch as both sides argue, laugh, threaten to walk away, then return with sly smiles. Commerce is never dull here. It's a theatre, and both actors know their lines. Historians still argue whether these forts represented European dominance or African control. On one hand, Europeans wrote as if they had conquered and secured the coast. On the other, local rulers could easily blockade, starve out, or outright destroy a fort if they chose. The truth probably leans toward a fragile partnership, balanced on shifting sands of power and profit. At night, lanterns glow in the fort's windows, casting golden squares onto the sand. You hear drums from nearby villages, echoing against the walls, blending with the sailors' songs in strange harmonies. The air smells of palm wine and roasted fish, carried in by the breeze. You feel the tension but also the blending, like two instruments trying to play in tune without a conductor. And because no sleepy history is complete without an absurd image, picture a Portuguese officer, stiff in his velvet doublet, being schooled at a dance by a coastal drummer who finds his rhythm laughably stiff, feet shuffling awkwardly on stone, hands flapping like confused birds. If there was ever proof that history is awkward before it's grand, that's it. The forts stand, stone against tide, but you sense they're not immovable. They're more like temporary markers in a story still being written. Symbols of ambition, compromise, and the uneasy marriage of two worlds that never really trusted each other. You sit by the seawall as moonlight glimmers off the waves. The fortress looms behind you, humming with voices, clinking cups and shuffling feet. And you wonder, who truly owns this space? The men who built the walls? Or the traders who make those walls echo with business every single day? The next morning feels sticky, like the air itself has been dipped in honey and left to melt in the sun. You wander past the fort again, but this time your feet carry you inland, along faint paths where villagers lead you toward gathering spots. Not military courtyards, not grand palaces, just wide clearings shaded by baobabs, where men and women sit in circles with baskets between them. Here, you see the quiet power of the local markets and councils. The smell of smoked fish lingers, mixed with the sweetness of cola nuts and the sharp tang of fermented palm wine. Voices overlap like birdsong. Some are bargaining, others gossiping, and a few are laughing loud enough to rattle the goats tied nearby. It feels chaotic, but after watching for a while, you notice the order beneath it. The elders sit closest to the center. Young traders fan out at the edges, and everyone knows exactly who speaks when. Mainstream historical fact. In many West African societies, markets were often overseen by councils, sometimes of elders, sometimes of women, who specialized in regulating trade. In Yoruba towns, for example, the Iyalode held significant influence over market decisions, balancing fairness and profit. These weren't side details. They were central nodes in the social fabric, where disputes were settled, prices adjusted, and outsiders cautiously welcomed. You sit at the edge of one such circle as two traders argue over a bolt of cloth. One insists the dye will fade after one wash. The other swears it was woven by the best hands in the savannah. The council listens, nods, and finally the eldest woman smirks, dips the cloth in a nearby pot of water, wrings it out, and holds it up to the sun. The color holds. Case closed. The seller beams. The buyer mutters but pays. Justice. Marketplace style. Here's the quirky tidbit that makes you grin. In some markets, traders used cowrie shells not just as currency, but also as a way to count and record debts. People wore belts strung with shells like clunky wallets. You imagine one guy fumbling with his belt, spilling cowries all over the ground, and scrambling to pick them up while everyone around sighs. Imagine dropping your entire bank account in the dirt, one tiny shell at a time. What strikes you most is how these councils balance seriousness and humor. A dispute can drag for an hour, voices rising, hands waving dramatically. But then someone cracks a sly joke, and the tension dissolves. It's like a built-in system against grudges. No one leaves too angry, just a little poorer or wiser. The Portuguese and other Europeans, for all their fort walls and ledgers, often had to bend to these councils. They couldn't simply dictate prices or seize goods. They had to negotiate within the framework already here. Historians still argue whether this meant African societies held the upper hand in early exchanges, or whether Europeans subtly reshaped these systems to their advantage. The answer likely shifts depending on which market, which decade, and which chief you ask. By mid-afternoon, the sun hammers the clearing. Traders retreat into shade, chewing cola nuts for energy. You chew one too, and again the bitterness shocks you awake. The councils keep working, though slower now, their words flowing like the lazy drift of smoke from cooking fires. A small boy runs past you carrying a talking drum, relaying a message from one part of the village to another. The beats echo faintly in the distance, maybe announcing that more traders are on the way, maybe just reminding someone to bring home more palm oil. You can't tell, but the rhythm feels like a pulse threading the whole community together. And because you're slipping into that sleepy humor, one man arrives with a goat tied to a rope, insisting it's part of his payment. The council groans. The goat bleats as if to argue its own worth. Finally, the goat is untied and allowed to wander, nibbling at someone's basket. Trade settled, goat style. As twilight seeps in, the market winds down. People pack baskets, councils disperse, and fires spark alive to grill fish and heat broth. You sit back, the hum of voices slowly fading into the rustle of leaves. It doesn't feel like a battlefield of empire here. It feels like the steady heartbeat of a community keeping itself in balance. One trade, one argument, one laugh at a time, and you realize for all the stone forts and creaky ships, this is where the real decisions were made. In the dirt, in the shade, among people who knew the worth of cloth, the weight of salt, and the value of laughter after a long day. The sky is heavy with mist tonight, the kind that clings to your eyelashes and makes every torch flame blur into a halo. You drift along a narrow path, the hum of insects louder than the waves you've left behind. Then you hear it, chanting, low and steady, punctuated by the clatter of drums. The sound pulls you into a clearing where figures gather around a fire, their silhouettes shifting like shadows learning to dance. This isn't a marketplace or a fort. This is a space of spiritual crossroads, where trade and belief twist together. Goods may pass hands here, but so do prayers, oaths, and whispers to the unseen. A mainstream historical fact, religion and commerce were deeply entwined in West Africa. Islam had been present for centuries through Saharan caravans, spreading literacy, mosques, and legal traditions that often smoothed trade across regions. At the same time, local spiritual systems thrived, rich with divination, ancestor reverence, and protective charms. Traders might consult both an imam for a blessing and a diviner for safe passage, covering all bases, like buying travel insurance and packing your lucky socks. You sit at the edge of the circle, watching as one man places a small bag on the ground. Inside, you glimpse cowries, bits of iron, maybe dried herbs. He murmurs to the fire, asking for fortune on tomorrow's journey. Another man fingers a string of prayer beads, lips moving silently. The two don't clash. They simply exist together, like overlapping melodies. Quirky tidbit. Some traders swore by protective charms so elaborate they'd hang animal bones from their saddles, or sew amulets into their clothing. One story tells of a man who wore a charm claiming to make him invisible to bandits. Spoiler, it did not. Bandits apparently could see him just fine, though maybe they laughed so hard they let him go. The fire pops. Smoke drifts upward, carrying prayers, bargains, and perhaps a touch of mischief. The chanting continues, softer now, like a lullaby woven with drum beats. You feel the layers of belief pressed gently against you, not in conflict, but in negotiation, much like the markets. Historians still argue whether Islam's spread in these regions was primarily through peaceful trade or through political authority. Was it merchants convincing neighbors with both Quranic verses and attractive textiles, or rulers adopting the faith to cement alliances? Either way, the blending is clear. A man might recite a verse before lifting a bale of cola nuts, then slip a carved charm into his pouch just in case. You lie back on the packed earth, staring up through the smoke. The stars are faint tonight, blurred by haze, but you sense their presence. Around you, the traders share food, passing calabashes of sweetened drink, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of belief. Someone tells a tale of ancestors who once guided caravans by dreams. Another counters with a joke about spirits demanding better tolls than kings. The circle laughs, firelight flickering across teeth and eyes. Your eyelids droop, but you catch one last moment. A woman sprinkling powder into the flames. the sparks rising like a spray of gold dust, brief and brilliant. It reminds you of trade itself, fleeting exchanges, glowing for a moment before vanishing into the night. And as the chanting thins, your mind drifts. You wonder if the real engine of commerce wasn't just salt and gold, but this, trust in the unseen. The rituals that turned a dangerous journey into something survivable. Then again, maybe it was just the cola nuts keeping everyone awake long enough to survive the road. Either way, the mix of prayer and practicality makes the night feel steady, as though invisible hands are guiding each footstep forward. You close your eyes to the rhythm of drums, letting the layers of faith wrap around you like a woven cloth. One thread from the desert's mosques, another from the forest's shrines, stitched together by weary traders who never traveled alone. The air tonight feels different, thicker, restless, almost buzzing like a kettle just before it boils. You wander down to the harbor again, where ships sway under the moonlight. But the docks aren't sleepy now. They're crowded, loud, almost frantic. Traders argue, sailors haul crates, clerks scratch furiously at ledgers. Somewhere, a donkey brays in protest as someone tries to load it with goods far beyond its dignity. You've stepped into the beginning of the shifting trade, when the flow of gold, pepper, and ivory slowly starts giving way to something darker. At first, it's subtle. A few extra captives taken in a skirmish, a small group of prisoners offered as part of negotiations. No one's calling it a system yet. Just another line item in the buzzing economy. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 1500s, Portuguese traders were increasingly transporting enslaved Africans to Europe, and later to growing colonies in the Americas. At first, numbers were relatively small compared to what would come later. Dozens, then hundreds. But the pattern had begun. Ships once filled with peppercorns and ivory now left space for human cargo. You stand at the edge of the dock, hearing snippets of uneasy conversation. Some coastal traders mutter that captives are more trouble than they're worth. Dangerous, difficult, prone to escape. Others argue the foreigners are paying high prices, more than cloth or beads could fetch alone. The debate feels raw, unsettled, like no one quite understands what they're agreeing to. Quirky tidbit. Some early European buyers were so desperate to mark their property that they carried hot branding irons onto ships. Imagine being a sailor told to brand goats one week and human beings the next, all while seasickness makes you reconsider lunch. History rarely mentions the absurd horror of someone stumbling on a rolling deck, nearly branding the mast instead. You feel the tension in your bones. The fort walls loom larger now, not just as marketplaces, but as holding pens. Small rooms carved into stone begin to serve new purposes. The laughter you heard in markets and councils seems muted here, replaced by guarded silence. Historians still argue whether African leaders initially resisted this shift or adapted quickly to the profit it promised. Were they coerced, tricked, or strategic in their participation? The truth is tangled. Some resisted fiercely, while others saw captives as a resource already embedded in warfare and debt systems, now with a new, unsettling outlet. As night deepens, the ships creak louder, their holds yawning open like hungry mouths. You imagine the traders pacing, weighing gold dust against lives. For now, the balance still leans unevenly. Slaves are a small part. Gold and pepper still dominate. But you can feel it tipping, slowly, inexorably, like the tide you can't command. On the dock, a sailor sneezes dramatically, spilling a handful of peppercorns across the planks. The wind scatters them, tiny spheres bouncing into cracks. He curses, and another sailor laughs, reminding him that someone probably just lost a week's wages to the sea. For a brief moment, the absurdity lightens the air, just long enough for you to breathe again. But the laughter doesn't last. Behind the noise, you hear chains rattling faintly, tucked away in the shadows, waiting to become part of tomorrow's cargo. And you realize with a chill, this is the pivot point. The era of forts and friendly bartering is shading into something else entirely. The traders don't fully know it yet. The sailors don't either. Even the captives, bound in small groups, can't see how vast this system will grow. But you, standing here centuries later, can sense it like thunder in the distance. Still far off, but already rolling closer. The dock grows quieter as the night presses in. A final crate thuds shut, lanterns flicker. Someone hums a tune that doesn't sound like a lullaby at all. You hug your arms around yourself, as though bracing for a wind that hasn't yet arrived. The harbour smells different tonight. Less of pepper and fish, more of sweat, iron and fear. You step cautiously across the planks, feeling every creak beneath your feet, until you stand near a ship whose belly seems to groan louder than the waves themselves. Lanterns sway overhead, throwing long shadows across piles of rope, barrels, and something far heavier: chains. Now you witness the grim turn of the Atlantic trade fully in motion. Captives shuffle down to the docks under guard, their wrists bound, their steps slow and reluctant. The earlier trickle has become a flow. The forts no longer just echo with bargaining voices. They hold cramped rooms filled with people waiting to be forced onto ships. Mainstream historical fact: by the mid-1500s, thousands of Africans were being transported each year to plantations in the Americas. Portuguese ships carried many to Brazil, while Spanish colonies demanded labor for mines and fields. What began as an extra commodity became the main cargo. Forts like Elmina, once proud showcases of European stonework, became gateways of despair. You inch closer and see the sailors preparing the vessel. The hold yawns open, dark and damp. Buckets slosh as water is thrown across planks, though it does little to wash away the stench of confinement. Barrels of salted meat are stacked alongside casks of water. Nets hang overhead, ready to be stretched across the deck, not to catch fish, but to prevent desperate leaps into the sea. A quirky tidbit amid the bleakness. Sailors sometimes brought chickens aboard for fresh eggs, letting them strut across the deck. Imagine trying to look intimidating while a hen pecks your bootlace. The absurdity doesn't erase the cruelty, but it adds to the dissonance. The ship is at once a floating barnyard and a prison. The captives are forced aboard in small groups. You hear muffled cries, the shuffle of bare feet on wood, the clatter of chains. The sailors shout in languages that blend together. Portuguese commands, African interpreters translating, prayers whispered under breath. Some captives stare ahead blankly. Others glance at the water as though calculating impossible escapes. Historians still argue whether these early voyages were carefully organized enterprises or chaotic improvisations. Some records suggest detailed manifests, meticulous profit margins, and strict routines. Others reveal ships thrown together hastily, with shortages of food and constant outbreaks of disease. Perhaps both are true. Some voyages ran like grim clockwork. Others stumbled forward in misery and confusion. As the night drags on, the ship grows heavier, its hold packed tighter. You crouch near the edge, hearing the groans below deck mingle with the slap of waves. The air grows stifling, even where you stand in the open. You can't imagine what it feels like inside, yet you don't need to. You can already sense the despair pressing against the wood. A sailor leans on a barrel nearby, chewing something stringy, muttering that the voyage will be long but profitable. His words fall flat in the heavy air. Profit is a thin blanket against the reality of what's being prepared. And then, strangely, there's a moment of almost comic mishap. One sailor drops his pipe overboard, curses loudly and nearly topples after it. Another catches him by the collar, saving him from an embarrassing splash. For a heartbeat, everyone on deck laughs, the kind of laugh that bursts out uninvited, like a bubble rising from muck. Then the silence returns, heavier than before. You watch as the last lanterns dim and the ship settles into its night rhythm. The fort behind you hums faintly with activity, but here at the dock, all feels suspended, like breath held before a plunge. The sails are furled, the ropes tight, the cargo secured. Tomorrow, when the wind is right, the ship will leave. You step back from the gangplank, your feet heavy. The tide laps the shore, as steady as ever, indifferent to the human misery now tied to its rhythm. You realize that for every crate of pepper once shipped across this ocean, there will soon be hundreds of souls forced to make the same crossing against their will. The night closes around you, muffling the creaks, the whispers, the faint clink of chains, and you feel it. The coast itself seems to sigh, as though weary of what it has just become. The sails fill slowly as the wind rises, and you feel the deck tilt beneath your feet. The shoreline of West Africa fades into a hazy line behind you, the fortress walls shrinking until they look like children's blocks abandoned in the sand. Ahead stretches nothing but water, an endless, restless expanse that promises weeks of monotony, misery, and strange companionship. You shuffle across the deck, careful not to trip over ropes coiled like sleeping snakes. The sailors bark orders, their voices mixing with the snap of canvas overhead. Beneath your boots, the ship vibrates faintly with the groaning of timbers. as though the whole vessel has reluctantly agreed to this voyage. Somewhere below, muffled sounds seep upward, the shuffling of chained feet, the low moan of seasickness, the cough that always seems to multiply in close air. Mainstream historical fact. The Middle Passage could last 6 to 8 weeks depending on winds, sometimes longer. Captives were crammed tightly, forced to endure heat, darkness, and disease. Mortality rates often reached 15% or higher, though traders cynically calculated that even with losses, profit margins remained strong. Above deck, life takes on a different rhythm. Sailors climb rigging with the agility of cats, though some slip and curse when wet rope betrays them. Meals consist of salted fish, hard biscuits that could double as paving stones, and the occasional stew if supplies allow. One sailor jokes that if you can still chew the biscuit without losing a tooth, you've probably been blessed by Neptune. You're not sure whether to laugh or groan. Meanwhile, captives are sometimes brought above deck in small groups, made to exercise or at least breathe fresher air. The guards prod them along, while others sing softly under their breath, melodies that bend and stretch with sorrow, but also defiance. You lean against the railing, listening, realizing that music travels further than chains can reach. A quirky tidbit. Some sailors, perhaps out of boredom or twisted routine, kept parrots on board. The birds squawk nonsense in multiple languages, repeating curses, prayers, or fragments of song. Imagine the absurdity of a voyage filled with misery, punctuated by a parrot shrieking, "Heave-ho, pass the rum," in a thick accent. Still, the atmosphere is anything but light. Storms sweep suddenly across the ocean, lashing rain and tossing the ship like a toy. You cling to a mast, soaked and shivering, while sailors scurry like frantic spiders. Below deck, the captives have no such freedom. Their cries rise with the storm, echoing like trapped thunder. Historians still argue whether resistance on these voyages was frequent or rare. Some accounts describe coordinated uprisings, with captives overpowering small crews and steering ships back toward Africa, at least for a while. Others insist such events were uncommon, quickly suppressed. Either way, the possibility of rebellion haunted every voyage, shaping how captives were chained and how sailors carried weapons close at hand. Days blur into each other. The horizon never changes, only shades of blue by day, black by night. The crew plays dice when not working, carving crude symbols into the wood, or telling stories that blend truth with tavern exaggeration. You overhear one sailor claim he once saw a sea monster bigger than the ship itself. Another rolls his eyes, saying the only monster aboard is the cook's stew. As weeks pass, the hold grows heavier, not just with bodies, but with silence. Death creeps quietly, claimed by fever, dehydration, or despair. When someone passes, they are brought above deck briefly, wrapped in cloth, and slid into the sea. The splash echoes, then vanishes into the vastness. You stare at the ripples, realizing the Atlantic has become a graveyard invisible to the eye, yet immeasurably full. And then, as though the ocean wants to mock everyone aboard, dolphins appear, darting alongside the bow. Their sleek bodies leap in arcs, playful and free, as chains clink below. Sailors cheer, calling it a good omen. You wonder what the captives think, if they hear splashes and imagine the freedom just out of reach. Night settles differently at sea. The stars blaze in numbers you've never seen before, as if someone scattered diamonds across black velvet. You lie against a coil of rope, listening to the creak of the ship, the soft rush of water, the occasional cough from below. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by the parrot shouting curses at odd hours. Somewhere in the darkness, the line between survival and surrender feels thinner than a strand of hemp rope. The voyage is far from over. Ahead lies landfall, and with it, a new world that few on board can fully imagine. But for now, you remain caught in this limbo, adrift between coasts, between lives, between histories written and those still argued about in half-lit cabins. Land emerges like a smudge on the horizon, first just a faint grey strip, then slowly rising into green hills and patches of pale sand. You lean over the railing, blinking against the sunlight, realizing you've crossed the ocean. The smell hits you before the sight fully sharpens. Damp earth, new vegetation, and the faint tang of wood smoke drifting from somewhere inland. After weeks of salt and sweat, it's almost overwhelming. The ship groans into harbour, sails slackening as anchors drop. Boats row out to meet you, their oars dipping rhythmically, carrying merchants, overseers, and curious onlookers. They circle the vessel like gulls, already sizing up its human cargo. You hear the creak of ropes as the gangplanks are set, the shuffle of men preparing for the grim process of unloading. Mainstream historical fact: most captives arriving in the Americas were sold at auction or scrambles, where buyers rushed forward to claim as many as they could. They were inspected like livestock, teeth checked, muscles prodded, backs examined for scars. In colonies like Brazil, Jamaica, and Barbados, whole ports were designed around this grim commerce. You step cautiously onto the dock, the boards warm under your feet from the sun. All around, the landscape feels both strange and familiar, palm trees swaying in the breeze, but behind them, neat rows of sugarcane, sharp leaves catching the light. The fields stretch further than you can see, broken only by clusters of huts and the looming chimneys of sugar mills. The air hums with the sound of cutting, grinding, boiling. A whole economy fueled by sweet crystals that most Europeans will melt into tea without a thought. A quirky tidbit: in some Caribbean ports, musicians played fiddles during auctions, partly to mask the tension, partly to give the event an air of festivity. Imagine the bizarre dissonance: violin strings skipping merrily while chains clink and buyers shout prices. It's like throwing a birthday party at a tax office, only crueler. Captives are herded off the ship, eyes blinking against the sudden light. Some stumble, weakened by the crossing, while others scan the horizon, searching for any chance, however impossible, of escape. Overseers bark instructions, their accents a tangle of Spanish, Portuguese, English, or Dutch, depending on the colony. You notice how quickly individuals are stripped of their past identities, reduced to numbers on ledgers and labels on parchment. Historians still argue whether the first generations of Africans managed to preserve more of their cultural practices than later ones. Some suggest that fresh arrivals, speaking common languages and carrying shared traditions, were better able to maintain community bonds. Others claim the brutal disruption scattered people too widely, making cultural retention almost impossible. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Fragments survived, hidden in songs, recipes, and quiet rituals, even under relentless pressure to forget. You wander toward the fields, the sun heavy on your shoulders. Workers move in rhythm, cutting cane with machetes that glint like mirrors. The stalks fall with a whisper, then pile into carts pulled by oxen. The mill churns constantly, its wheels grinding, smoke billowing from chimneys. The sweet smell of boiling sugar coats the air, sticky enough that you taste it just by breathing. Yet the sweetness feels like mockery. You know it rests on sweat and suffering. Even here, small sparks of resilience appear. You overhear whispers in African tongues, songs hummed between strokes of the blade, stories told in the shade when overseers turn their backs. A few workers carve charms from wood, tucking them into belts or hair as reminders of home. Despite the system's attempts to erase them, culture bends without breaking. By evening, the dock's quiet. The ship, once so crowded, sits lighter in the water, its cargo dispersed. You remain standing near the waterline, watching the waves wash against pilings. Each ripple carries echoes of voices. Traders in Africa, sailors mid-ocean, captives now scattered across fields and kitchens. The Atlantic has become a thread-binding continent. But it is a rope wound tight with sorrow. And then, as if to taunt the seriousness of it all, a goat wanders loose on the dock, munching on a pile of papers someone dropped. Merchants shout, trying to shoo it away, but the goat trots off proudly with a mouthful of ledger sheets. You can't help smirking. Perhaps history is telling you that not every number survives, no matter how carefully it's recorded. The sun dips low, painting the sugarcane gold. Shadows stretch long, swallowing the dock, the fields, and the people moving like ants across the landscape. You realize this new world, built on old suffering, is only just beginning to reveal its true weight. Night falls slowly in the colonies, with the last glow of sunset clinging to the horizon like a stubborn ember. You sit on a rough wooden crate near the dock, watching the sky shift from deep orange to soft violet, until finally the stars prick through again, familiar yet foreign above this new land. The harbour quiets, but the hum of sugar mills inland never fully dies. It's as if the earth itself has been shackled to the rhythm of grinding wheels. You think back to the coast of Africa, the fort walls glowing under torchlight, the smell of pepper and fish in the markets, the small jokes exchanged between traders trying to lighten their burden. That world feels both near and impossibly distant now. The journey across the Atlantic has stretched it thin, turning the once fluid exchanges of goods into rigid chains of forced labour. Mainstream historical fact: by the 1600s and 1700s, the Atlantic economy depended almost entirely on enslaved African labour. Sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from Virginia, and later cotton from the American South all fed into European markets. Ships returned with guns, cloth and alcohol, completing what is often called the triangular trade. It was a machine that devoured lives to sweeten tea and light pipes. You wander toward the fields once more. The cane stalks whisper in the evening wind, tall and sharp, their edges catching faint light. Workers return slowly to their quarters, steps dragging, shoulders stooped. Some still hum softly, carrying fragments of songs across the rows. Their voices blend with the rustle of cane, weaving a fragile fabric of continuity. You pause, realizing those hums are threads that will stretch through centuries, echoing in places as distant as church choirs in Georgia or carnival parades in Trinidad. A quirky tidbit: planters often imported cats to keep rats from devouring sugarcane stores. But the cats became so numerous that they prowled through houses, kitchens, and even auction yards, interrupting solemn events by leaping onto tables. Imagine a cat casually batting at quills while buyers argued over human lives. A reminder that even in the darkest settings, absurd little interruptions claw their way in. Historians still argue whether African traders were coerced, complicit, or caught in unavoidable cycles. Some emphasize their agency and negotiation, while others highlight manipulation by European powers. The truth, as always, is tangled. Individuals made choices under immense pressure, shaped by hunger, rivalry, or survival. History resists neat categories, preferring instead the messy middle ground where most human lives actually unfold. You step back toward the shore. The waves lap gently, reflecting moonlight in silver streaks. Across that water lies the route you traveled, a path now invisible, yet permanently etched into memory. The Atlantic seems calm tonight, but you know it carries countless secrets beneath its surface. Bones resting quietly in darkness. Songs swallowed mid-voyage, languages whispered and lost. The dock is almost empty now. A stray chicken pecks at crumbs. Sailors snore inside taverns, and a lantern swings lazily in the breeze. You sit quietly, breathing slower, the tension of the day loosening. The story has carried you far, but it doesn't need to rush anymore. And so the narration softens, as though the waves themselves are urging you to let go. Your eyelids grow heavy, matching the slow roll of the tide. You're not in the fortress anymore, not on the ship, not even in the cane fields. You're drifting gently across time, listening to voices that still hum in the night air. The past is heavy, yes, but here in this quiet moment, it feels like a lullaby, one that carries sorrow, resilience, and the faintest hope that tomorrow might bend a little softer than today. Wind down. 300 words. Now the rhythm slows even further. You feel the air cool around you, carrying the faintest scent of salt and earth, settling on your skin like a soft blanket. Each breath deepens, each blink lasts longer, until the world itself seems to sway in harmony with your heartbeat. The creak of ships, the whisper of cane leaves, the lapping of waves, all dissolve into a single, soothing hum. You picture the ocean again, vast and endless, but no longer threatening. It stretches calmly, silver under the moon, carrying not fear, but stillness. Every ripple moves at its own patient pace, unhurried, unconcerned with deadlines or debts. That slow, gentle water reminds you that time itself can soften sharp edges if you let it. Your shoulders sink a little lower. The wooden dock beneath you feels almost like a rocking cradle. Somewhere in the distance, voices murmur, faint and indistinct. But they're not urgent now. They're more like background music, fading into the night. Even the goat chewing on stray papers earlier feels like part of the dream. A quiet reminder that history, however heavy, is never without its quirks. The stars overhead glow steadily, guiding nothing in particular, just existing, just shining. You let your eyes drift across them, but without effort, without the need to count or chart. You simply let them be, the way you let yourself be in this moment. And so you breathe slowly, evenly, deeply. The story has brought you across coasts, oceans, and fields, but now it has settled you here, at rest. Your eyes close, the night holds you gently. Sleep comes easily, like a tide returning to shore.